What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I'd like to introduce you back to Datasheet Deep Dive, the video series I haven't done in way too long.
Oh my god!
I've seen a lot of comments over the last couple weeks about Hive Tyrants, so I figured now would be a good time to talk about the basic Hive Tyrant datasheets in the new 9th Ed Tyranid Codex. Unfortunately, today we're not going to be talking about Swarmlord, but what we will be talking about are overviews of the winged and foot Hive Tyrants, any particular synergies they have with specific Hive fleets, as well as important stratagems to keep in mind when talking about Hive Tyrants, the best relics and Warlord traits to kit them out because they are characters, and a final verdict. Not only whether or not you should include Hive Tyrants in your army, which, spoiler alert, you should. They're super awesome. Also, which build is best? Should you take a foot Hive Tyrant, a winged Hive Tyrant? What loadout should you take? We're going to be covering all of that in this video, so let's get into it. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k and Tyranid content, please drop me a like, drop me a subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. I really appreciate it. And let's get on into the video. Now, before we talk about the data sheets, I do want to enter one caveat. We're gonna assume some rules as written here. In the current version of the codex that we have to look at, character units cannot take adaptive physiologies. So we're gonna be assuming that Hive Tyrants do not get access to adaptive physiologies, and foot Hive Tyrants can take multiple biocannons. Now, a little bit of background information about Hive Tyrants. All versions of Hive Tyrants are kind of predicated on the inclusion of Tyrant Guard along with them. For those who don't know, Tyrant Guard have a bodyguard effect for Hive Tyrants, meaning that while a Hive Tyrant is within 3 inches of a Tyrant Guard, they cannot be targeted by ranged attacks. This not only means that your opponent has to kill the Tyrant Guard before they're able to engage the Hive Tyrants at range, it also works if the Tyrant Guard isn't even in line of sight of your opponent. Meaning that as long as you can find an appropriately placed piece of obscuring terrain that your Tyrant Guard can hide behind, as long as your Hive Tyrants remain anchored within 3 inches of that spot, they're functionally immune to ranged attacks. Keep in mind that things like smites and melee attacks will still be able to get them, but it allows them to play much more farther forward and out in line of sight without immediately getting vaporized by big guns. They are restricted to 1 per detachment, and this restriction is across all of the Hive Tyrant keyworded datasheets. This includes foot Hive Tyrants, winged Hive Tyrants, and Swarmlord, meaning that for each detachment you have a single Hive Tyrant slot, and taking any of those 3 will take up that slot, meaning you have to take multiple detachments if you want multiple Hive Tyrants. Because of the predication on Tyrant Guard, you'll often want to double up on Tyrants in your lists that run them in order to justify the inclusion of Tyrant Guard, since they are relatively expensive for a unit that would only be buffing a single Hive Tyrant if you're just taking 1, meaning taking 2 or more makes the list a little bit more efficient. Also, you should always take relic weapons on these guys. We're almost going to be discounting the standard weapons on them, but Tyranid relics have gone from being very bad to being some of the best in the game, especially their offensively oriented relics. Their Warlord traits maybe leave a little bit to be desired, but the way we're going to be discussing them in this video is assuming that you're taking a relic weapon, and we're going to be discussing the best relics that they have access to. And with that, let's move on to the actual datasheets proper. The foot Hive Tyrant is the tougher of the 2 varieties. It's relatively slow, only at movement 9, and it doesn't fly, but can take 2 sets of weapons unlike its winged cousin. These guys come in at a pretty resilient profile at toughness 8 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save thanks to their psychic barrier. Although, they only have 12 wounds, so they will lose those wounds pretty quickly if any powerful enemies are able to get to grips with them. They come in based with a 2+ weapon skill ballistic skill. This means that they're both good at shooting and melee. They come stock with 2 melee weapons, but the big upside of these guys is the ability to equip multiple biocannons. These include heavy venom cannons and stranglethorn cannons. Each cannon will replace 1 set of their melee weapons, so either a pair of scything talons or a lash whip plus bone sword. There is an argument to be made for taking a single cannon as well as a melee weapon to allow them to operate in multiple phases. Although, one thing to keep in mind is that due to their slow movement speed and their monster keyword lacking fly or infantry to allow them to move through or over walls, they do get stuck behind a lot of models and terrain, meaning it's very difficult to actually deliver them into melee, even with Tyrant Guard supporting them. That said, the only restriction on their cannons is that they can't be equipped with both a Stranglethorn cannon and a Heavy Venom cannon. That said, you can exchange both of your weapons for 2 sets of the same cannon. In addition, any relic cannons that you upgrade them with wholesale replace the original weapon you were giving them. And because list building in 40k is sort of a nebulous zone where you can essentially sequence any of your muster phase options however you want. You can take, for example, a Stranglethorn cannon, upgrade it to the Balethorn cannon, which replaces the Stranglethorn cannon, meaning you are no longer equipped with the Stranglethorn cannon, then take a Heavy Venom cannon on top of that. In my opinion, the big upside of this datasheet is this ability to equip multiple cannons, and this creates what I like to call the Battleship Tyrant.
Let's drop some
acid and worms and shit
on those motherfuckers.
Which just rocks 2 styles of cannons and steams around the table, hanging out by backline Tyrant guards, so as to be untargetable by ranged attacks and blasting folks. This build is phenomenal against enemies who want to get into a big gunfight with you, since they can trade shots without exposing any of your assets to enemy fire. That said, there are some big drawbacks, given that they do nothing against an opponent who just hides from you, or just trades with your units from behind line of sight. Enemies with artillery, or who just use small, fast trading units to run up on your army and get some work done before ostensibly dying in your melee or psychic phase, means that these Hive Tyrants are basically not going to be contributing. Hive Tyrants also have some base abilities that we should talk about. They have the Will of the Hive Mind special rule, which allows you to Synaptic Link out a reroll ones to hit effect to a High Fleet core unit. This is most likely going to be on your small units of warriors or raveners, but isn't generally the #1 reason that you're taking Hive Tyrants. You can, especially on a support-oriented Battleship Tyrant, take a Warlord trait like Direct Guidance to give a unit +1 to hit, then also give them reroll hits of 1, meaning that they should convert almost all of their attacks, given that they'll be hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s. Like I mentioned before, Hive Tyrants all base have a 4+ invulnerable save, and they are synapse creatures, meaning they generate and extend your synaptic links. Importantly, they also cast 2 psychic powers and deny 1 psychic power. This allows them to either be more offensively oriented, dealing some additional damage with offensive spells like Smite or Psychic Scream while sitting at the front, or be support oriented by casting your support spells from the back line. They will usually be taken in concert with a Neurothrope, however, who has much more consistent casting than the Hive Tyrant, although they will benefit from the Neurothrope's Imperative in order to give the Hive Tyrant +1 on both of its casts, which is pretty useful. Hive Tyrants also generate their own Imperative, allowing your army to fall back and charge for a turn. This is especially good on the Winged Hive Tyrant. Speaking of the Winged Hive Tyrant, let's talk about this guy for a little bit. In my opinion, this is the superior of the two, given that it is the fastest non-aircraft unit in the entire Tyranid army, and is able to project a strong melee punch far past the midline of the table. Usually, you can find obscuring terrain somewhere just outside your deployment zone, anchor your Tyrant Guard there, sit your Winged Hive Tyrant somewhere around the center line of the table, and with a 16-inch move buffed to 17-inch move by upgrading them with Adrenal Glands, alongside access to the Onslaught power to let them advance and charge, can threaten somewhere in the mid to high 20 inches. Obviously, with the Fly keyword, this allows the Winged Hive Tyrant to access units that your opponent is potentially hiding from the rest of your guns, and get into enemy ranged attackers that are trying to stay as far away from your other melee threats as possible. There are some downsides to the Winged Hive Tyrant, however. It is a little bit easier to kill than its ground-pounding brother, with only toughness 7 and a 3+ save. It does have that 4+ invulnerable save, but you will find that Winged Hive Tyrants oftentimes will get knocked out pretty quickly if they're able to be caught. That said, Winged Hive Tyrants should almost never be attacked by enemy models, and I'll talk about exactly why a little bit later on in the video. They also only have 1 set of arms, but trade the second set for some buffs, including that additional movement speed. They are an awesome melee combatant with 2 extra little attacks from its talons to give it extra volume against infantry, or the ability to ping for 1 damage before it attacks with its big damage swings, which can situationally be very useful, and it can deep strike innately with the upside that it rerolls its deep strike for free. It also comes equipped with a Prehensile Pincer Tail, which gives it a Master Artisan style reroll, a reroll to hit or wound in the fight phase. Unlike the Foot Hive Tyrant, I would almost always equip Winged Hive Tyrants with melee weapons, meaning that the 2 units fulfill entirely different roles. Now let's move on and talk about some of the particular sub-faction abilities that really buff the different varieties of Hive Tyrants. I'll start by talking about biomorphologies, because a lot of different sub-factions have access to different biomorphology trees, and so we'll be able to take them in context. First off, Heightened Reflexes allows these units to fall back and shoot with -1 to hit, basically the Ultramarines chapter tactic. This is awesome on a ranged-focused Battleship Hive Tyrant, especially since the Hive Tyrant Synaptic Imperative allows you to fall back and charge as well. Since the Stranglethorn Cannon variety of Biocannon is also a blast weapon, it can't be fired into melee, so if you're upgrading to the Balethorn Cannon on a Battleship Tyrant, you won't be able to fire the Relic weapon into melee, and that means that Heightened Reflexes is very important to allow him to continue to shoot On the flip side, augmented ferocity is awesome for flying Hive Tyrant, since +1 to charge makes their charges that much easier. It is pretty devastating if you fail a charge with the flying Hive Tyrant, so you want to be able to confirm those as much as possible, and especially against enemies that are going to be trying to stay as far away from your melee-focused army as possible, +1 to charge is pretty sweet. In the sub-factions that get access to lurk biomorphologies, there is a big upside for any monster keyworded unit, and that is the territorial instincts biomorphology, which gives all monsters objective secured, and monsters with a wounds characteristic of 10 or more, including Hive Tyrants, count as 5 models when controlling an objective. This means that you can play very aggressively with things like flying Hive Tyrants in order to disrupt your opponent's scoring, potentially take down their banners, or disrupt locked objectives, as well as having that extra bonus for scoring things like Stranglehold. On the flip side, you can lock in your defensive objectives with a Battleship Tyrant, being Obtech and 5 extra models sitting on that objective, especially in a monster-focused list that's going to be relatively low model count, makes it much harder for your opponent to run in and contest those objectives. So now let's talk about some specific Hive Fleet synergies, in no particular order. First off, Behemoth has access to that lurk biomorphology, which I just talked about. +1 to wounded melee from Unstoppable Onslaught is very good for any melee-focused unit, and means that a flying Hive Tyrant equipped to the Bone Sword is going to be wounding basically anything in the game on 2s, which is pretty solid. Both the Warlord trait and relics are also pretty interesting. Monstrous Hunger dealing mortal wounds on unmodified wound rolls of 6, especially on a flying Hive Tyrant where your Warlord trait slot's going to be relatively open, since there aren't a lot of awesome Warlord trait picks for them, especially in a Behemoth list. This is kind of a nice free roll to have for 1 CP, and will improve the damage output of this unit just a little bit. It also helps that flying Hive Tyrant has a pretty high volume of attacks, so you have more chances to get those mortal wounds, since they will trigger on its feet attacks as well. The relic for Behemoth is also pretty good for a flying Hive Tyrant. It gives +1 damage to all of the melee weapons the bearer is equipped with. You do give up a lot of bonuses by not taking one of the other relic weapons, but it does improve the damage of your feet attacks in addition to your main weapon attacks, bringing something like a monstrous bone sword up to 4 damage alongside 2 damage feet attacks, meaning that a Behemoth flying Hive Tyrant is actually going to hit like a truck. Unfortunately, the +1 strength for these guys is not super relevant, since you're going to be attacking at strength 9, 10, or 11 anyway, depending on the kit of the Hive Tyrant, so adding 1 to that doesn't really change math, generally speaking. Hive Fleet Kraken is about making things go fast, and especially when you have flying Hive Tyrants trying to move aggressively up the table, get onslaughted, and charge deep into your opponent's backline. Having access to opportunistic advance or the adaptive ability of Hive Fleet Kraken to add D3+3 to your move instead of the normal D6 for advancing makes those moves that much easier. I just talked about how important it is to confirm those charges, and advancing 25 inches on a flying Hive Tyrant with adrenal glands and opportunistic advance means that it will be able to get super long threat ranges pretty easily. You can continue to combo that with augmented ferocity for an additional +1 on your charge roll as well, meaning that your charges are very difficult to fail. Hive Fleet Leviathan is one of the standout Hive Fleets for the entirety of the game, but does have a lot of synergy with Hive Tyrants in specific. The transhuman effect on all your Synapse creatures is great. It means you'll never have to spend 4 Indomitable Monstrosity when your Hive Tyrants get attacked, but again, that should happen relatively rarely, so it's not the biggest of deals. The single hit reroll is good specifically for Battleship Tyrants that are trying to shoot a lot. Winged Hive Tyrants should have full rerolls in melee most of the time, so you don't really need it quite as much, although Perfectly Adapted is probably the best Warlord trait in the Codex for a Hive Tyrant. It gives you a once per battle round hit, wound, advanced charge, or psychic test, or saving throw reroll. You can also reroll damage, but they don't have any random damage weapons, so that one doesn't really matter so much. All of which are going to be useful. Whether it's rerolling a random invulnerable save that you didn't want to fail early on, rerolling a random psychic test so you don't perils, or just throwing it in to reroll a charge roll if you really need to convert that charge, is super awesome. It only costs 1 CP to add a Warlord trait to a Tyranid character, and you'll usually get more than 1 CP worth of effectiveness out of this. Since Hive Tyrants are oftentimes the focal point of your army, you're going to be burning CP rerolls on them anyway, so having one of them for free is pretty solid. This even works pretty well for the ranged focused Tyrants, since you can reroll a wound roll alongside getting that hit roll from the Leviathan adaptation, and given the high strength in their weapons, that usually means that they'll convert basically all of their attacks, which is pretty useful. Hive Fleet Gorgon has a similar synergy with its adaptive trait, giving you a single wound reroll. Pretty useful for the gun-focused Tyrants who want that wound reroll. Not quite as useful for the flying Hive Tyrants who are going to be mostly rerolling their wounds in melee anyway, but still worth talking about. Gorgon also has access to Lurk Biomorphology, so it's going to be able to give those Hive Tyrants objectives secured as well. Lastly, Hive Fleet Hydra improves the speed of your Hive Tyrant, which can help in some situations, moving your flying Hive Tyrant up to move 18 inches, which is pretty cool, and allowing them to pile in and consolidate a little bit more. The Warlord trait, Endless Regeneration, is actually not too bad on these guys as well. Flying Hive Tyrants will occasionally take some random damage if they're stuck in melee with somebody, and being able to regenerate constantly with those guys is pretty sweet, especially since, to my knowledge, this Warlord trait will continue to heal you even if you've returned to reserve using the Encircle the Prey stratagem, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Real quick note here as well from editing Trevi, just talking about Hive Fleet Kronos. I didn't even put them in my notes, but I know that someone's going to call me out in the comments if I don't touch on them. Hive Fleet Kronos has a lot of synergies for ranged attacks, but none of them are particularly relevant to Hive Tyrants themselves. Giving extra range to an already long-range gun isn't super useful. Extra AP to guns that already have AP 3 or 4. Also, not the most exciting thing ever, and +1 strength on a gun that is usually somewhere between strength 9 and 12 doesn't actually change any of the math on most of the profiles you're going to be shooting at. So despite the fact that Hive Fleet Kronos is the ranged-focused subfaction, they actually kind of have the least synergy with the ranged-focused Hive Tyrant, although they do have access to Lurk Biomorphology, so you can make them objective secured, which is nice. Now let's talk about some stratagems. Now, a lot of these are going to synergize specifically with the flying Hive Tyrant. Tyranid melee units are typically going to be using a lot of CP in order to buff themselves or reposition themselves during the fight phase, and the flying Hive Tyrant is kind of the nexus for that style of mechanics. First off, Voracious Appetite allows you to reroll your wound rolls in melee. Anytime you don't have rerolls built in and you really need something to be dead, you should be using the stratagem. It's not specifically good on flying Hive Tyrants, but given that they're going to be the fastest, most melee-oriented units in your army, whichever Hive Tyrant needs it is going to be using this every turn. Similar for Adrenal Surge, which will give them plus D3 attacks if they are equipped with an adrenal glands. And especially once kitted out with relics, Hive Tyrant attacks tend to be such high value that even getting one extra attack for 1 CP is going to be pretty good for these guys. Death Frenzy allows you to fight on death. Pretty good for a flying Hive Tyrant that gets caught out and accidentally killed, although generally speaking, they shouldn't be dying in melee too often, and you can help ensure their charges by using the Pheromone Trail or Shard Lure stratagems. Now, before we move off of the Flyrant, there are some other ones that are useful for both types of Hive Tyrants. First off, Indomitable Monstrosity gives you a transhuman effect on any Tyranid monster, Hive Tyrants included. Not super useful if you're playing them in Hive Fleet Leviathan, but having access to this ability in any Hive Fleet is pretty solid. Trampling Charge is also very useful to deal some mortal wounds on the charge, especially since both versions of Hive Tyrants have the Horned Chitin keyword, meaning that they get the enhanced version of the strat. Also, Rapid Regeneration lets them heal D3 wounds in your command phase, but to be honest, if you're taking too much damage early on your Hive Tyrants, you're probably doing something wrong. Also, just because I know somebody's going to call me out in the comments if I don't mention them, there are all of the psychic buffing stratagems that can affect Hive Tyrants. There's not particularly any synergy between Hive Tyrants and these stratagems, though. You can use them on any of the Tyranid Psychers. Now, before we move on, let's talk about the two most important stratagems, in my opinion, for Hive Tyrants, and specifically flying Hive Tyrants. Those being Overrun and Encircle the Prey. Overrun triggers at the end of your fight phase and allows you to move as long as you're not in engagement range of enemies and haven't made a consolidation move during that phase. This is a normal move, so it's important to note that you can't advance with it, but any other move bonuses that you have active, like the Hive Fleet Hydra, subfaction ability, or Adrenal Glands will apply, meaning this could potentially be up to an 18-inch move. This is most useful when your Hive Tyrant is going out and skirmishing in the middle of the board, clearing out enemy screening units or aggressive units that have moved up a little bit too far. Overrun just allows them to move back, get out of line of sight, potentially back to your Tyrant guards, and out of charge range of any enemy counterstrikes. This is one of the reasons that I say that Hive Tyrants really shouldn't be endangered too often, since they're able to range out and use that super long movement to come back at the end of the fight phase as long as you or the rest of your army has killed whatever they were fighting. Even if you haven't killed it, you can use the second strategy, Encircle the Prey, to remove that Hive Tyrant from the board entirely at the end of your turn. This only works on the flying Hive Tyrant, obviously, because it only works on flying units or burrowers, and returns whatever unit you use it on into reserve, deploying them as a deep striker during your next reinforcement step. There are some insane uses for this. You can potentially sink your Hive Tyrant into the heart of the enemy army. As long as you're sure it's not going to be killed on the swing back during your own fight phase, you can then just pull it off the table and your opponent isn't going to be able to interact with it charging or shooting because it's going to be back in reserve. Because it triggers at the end of your turn, it also has the same timing as a lot of secondary objectives, especially maneuver style secondaries like Engage in All Fronts or Stranglehold. This allows the Hive Tyrant to run out, do what it wants to, cast some spells, maybe charge some people, then score your secondary objective. Especially if the Hive Tyrant is objective secured, he can potentially be contesting or stealing an objective from your opponent, giving you easy access to Stranglehold. Then you can sequence your Encircle the Prey at the end of the turn after you've scored those secondaries and allow that Hive Tyrant to run back into reserve. This stratagem is probably the most powerful stratagem in the entire Tyranid Codex, and maybe one of the most powerful stratagems in the game. Even if your flying Hive Tyrant runs out into the middle of the table and tries a long bomb charge on some enemy artillery or ranged units in order to try to clear them out, even if you fail, you can still just encircle at the end of the turn, so you haven't really lost anything for trying. You do have to come back the next battle round outside 9 inches of enemies, which means that the Hive Tyrant probably isn't charging that turn, especially since flying Hive Tyrants don't benefit from their built-in Deep Strike reroll if they use an ability not on their datasheet to Deep Strike, but you can just deploy them back near your Tyrant Guard and make them unshootable to set up for a big charge on the next turn. If you have multiple flying Hive Tyrants, you can be cycling them in and out, using Encircle the Prey on one of the Hive Tyrants while setting up for a charge with the other one, and your opponent is going to continually take powerful melee attacks with no real way to interact with the Hive Tyrants and fight back against them. So yeah, this stratagem is ludicrous and super duper strong. So let's move on to talk about some Warlord traits that you can combo it with. Now, I mentioned before that Tyranid Warlord traits aren't the best, although there are a couple in here that you can get a little bit of effectiveness out of on your Hive Tyrants. First off, Alien Cunning gives you access to objective secured, and you count as 5 models when controlling an objective marker without having to be in a Lurk biomorphology subfaction to get access to that territorial instincts biomorph. Heightened Senses is almost required for the battleship style Hive Tyrants since they're going to be making 6+ attacks every turn. Being able to reroll any ones you roll to shoot is super useful and dramatically increases the average damage output of that Hive Tyrant build. Adaptive Biology is also a pretty good one, just making the Hive Tyrant slightly more difficult to kill. And lastly, Direct Guidance is a Warlord trait you should probably always have somewhere in your list, giving +1 to hit to a core unit. This just makes small units like your Tyranid Warriors that much better at fighting, and especially when combined with the Hive Tyrants reroll 1s, makes their attacks super consistent. This isn't very good on the flying Hive Tyrants, since especially if they're encircling the prey, they won't be able to use their Direct Guidance the next turn, but it's very good on a more support-oriented Hive Tyrant, especially a foot Hive Tyrant, that's going to be standing in the back of your army and shooting. Alright, lastly, let's talk about the different Hive Tyrant builds and the best weapons to equip them with. We'll start by talking about foot Hive Tyrants and comparing the different relic cannons that you can upgrade them with. The options that we have here that are available to all Hive fleets are the Balethorn Cannon and Shard Gullet. They're both upgrades to the basic variety of Bio Cannon. The Balethorn Cannon is an upgraded Stranglethorn Cannon, increasing its strength to 10, AP3 for 3 flat damage. Shard Gullet is an upgrade to a heavy Venom Cannon and changes its weapon to Assault from heavy, allowing it to shoot in melee without a penalty, which is pretty nice, and increasing it to Strength 12, AP 5 for 5 damage. Now, generally speaking, if you're taking 2 cannons, you'll probably want your second cannon to be a heavy Venom Cannon to get those additional 3 shots at Strength 9, AP 3, 4 damage. The question is whether or not we want a Balethorn Cannon versus the Shard Gullet. Now, doing some math here, assuming that these weapons are wounding on 3s, which they're generally going to be doing unless your opponent has some sort of wound roll interaction, like Transhuman or a -1 to wound effect. Without any upgrades, the base Balethorn Cannon is going to be doing about 7 damage, 6.94, whereas Shard Gullet is going to be doing significantly more at 8.3 damage. This is assuming that we're firing at heavy multi-wound targets. If we're firing at a higher model count, the Balethorn Cannon is going to be slightly better, given that it makes on average more attacks than the Shard Gullet does, and especially if we're firing into a unit like Adeptus Custodes that are 3-wound infantry, the Balethorn Cannon is going to perform better. Shard Gullet, on the other hand, is going to do a little bit better against multi-wound targets, and there are some targets that it's absolutely phenomenal into. Talking about those Adeptus Custodes, Virtus Praetors are T6, 5 wounds, and the Shard Gullet is a perfect profile to wound them on 2s and one-shot a Virtus Praetor if its attack converts. Now, like I mentioned before, we have a couple ways to source rerolls with these guys. We can use the Hive Fleet Leviathan subfaction trait alongside Perfectly Adapted to get 2 floating rerolls somewhere during its shooting activation, and we can use the Heightened Senses Warlord trait to give them full rerolls to hit. We can see that when we do that, the average damage of the Balethorn Cannon increases significantly, although doesn't quite beat out Shard Gullet for raw damage. Shard Gullet at that point is going to be firing almost 9 damage, whereas the Balethorn Cannon is only shooting 8.1. In my opinion, I think you're generally going to want Shard Gullet over the Balethorn Cannon on your first Battleship Tyrant, but if you have a second one, upgrading it with the Balethorn Cannon is certainly not going to hurt. Assuming that you have heightened senses on that Hive Tyrant, a Heavy Venom Cannon also deals an additional 6.5-ish damage, meaning that the average damage out of either of these Hive Tyrant builds is somewhere around 14 to 15, which is absolutely ludicrous when you're firing at a base profile that doesn't have any invulnerable saves. Their damage will significantly decrease once you take invulnerable saves into account, but even so, the raw damage characteristics of these weapons is supremely impressive. That said, they do require your opponents to be standing out in the open and letting you shoot them. So sometimes it's better to go try to root them out of their hidey hole, and for that, we need a Flying Hive Tyrant. Now, Flying Hive Tyrants have a variety of weapons that are available to them. Monstrous Scything Talons and make them +2 strength AP4 for a flat 3 damage, while retaining its 2 additional attacks with that profile. On the flip side, the Reaper of Obliterax replaces a Bone Sword, deals a mortal wound for each successful wound roll, and passes through any damage ignore mechanics. I have mentioned in the past that I thought Reaper of Obliterax ignored damage reduction abilities as well. I actually misspoke. If you have a -1 damage or half damage style effect, the Reaper of Obliterax does nothing to counteract that. It's just effects that cap the number of wounds you would take or ignore wounds on a specific roll. It's important to note as well that to my knowledge, the additional mortal wound that the Reaper deals does not ignore any mortal wound ignoring mechanics that the target has, although that may be subject of a clarification in the future. Now, the one other relic weapon I want to talk about isn't so much a weapon as it is an upgrade to the character itself, and these are the Maw Claws of Thyrax. They give a passive +1 attack, full rerolls to wound, meaning you don't have to waste your CP on Voracious Appetite in order to be full rerolling with your melee tyrant, and in addition, each time you destroy a unit, they get a permanent +1 attack for the rest of the game. This means that if this is your Hive Tyrant that's going to be ranging out in front of your army and clearing away any enemy screens or forward deployers, they're going to be dramatically increasing their damage output for the late game when they go in to punch some harder targets. It's actually relatively easy to get to +2 or +3 attacks with this special ability from the Maw Claws, meaning that even if you're upgrading a Bone Sword equipped Hive Tyrant, you can be swinging as many as 8 or 9 times with that big 3 damage weapon with full rerolls. There's one more that I'd like to throw on the pile of relic melee weapons, and that is the Behemoth faction-specific Monstrous Musculature. This gives +1 damage to all of the melee weapons that the Hive Tyrant has. This means that it's going to be improving not only your main melee weapon, your Scything Talons or Monstrous Bone Sword, but will also improve the damage characteristic of your Talons. So over the course of potentially 7 Scything Talon attacks and 2 Tyrant Talon attacks, you're going to be getting a potential +9 damage, which is awesome. Now let's talk about all of these weapons in comparison to one another. I actually re-recorded this section because I originally reviewed Monstrous Bone Sword equipped Tyrants because that is the most consistent weapon, given that it gives you access to reroll ones to hit because of the Lash Whip special rule, on top of your potential rerolls to wound, either through taking Maw Claws or using the Voracious Appetite stratagem. That said, I thought it would be cool to do a battle royale of all of the relic tyrant weapons to really get a holistic look at the potential damage from these characters. So what I've gone ahead and done is approximated some average damage from all 4 of the relic weapons that I just mentioned. I assumed that the Maw Claw equipped tyrant was going to be taking a Monstrous Bone Sword to get those full rerolls, and I assumed that in order to get the maximum number of attacks, the Monstrous Muscular equipped tyrant was going to be taking a set of Scything Talons. Now, I've gone ahead and mathed out the average damage for all 4 of these weapons versus a target against which they wound on 3s that either just has a 3+ save or has a 4+ invulnerable save. And the numbers we get here are pretty astronomical, so buckle up. I've also assumed that we have our hit rolls available, so the Lash Whip is going to be rerolling all the ones to hit for any of the Monstrous Bone Sword equipped Tyrants, the Reaper and the Maw Claws, and we can use our Prehensile Pincer Tail to reroll a single hit roll for the Scything Talon varieties of Hive Tyrant. I've assumed that we've rerolled a hit roll on the Scything Talons themselves, so those Tyrant Talons are not going to be benefiting from a hit reroll. Now, first off, looking at the Reaper of Obliterax, one thing to keep in mind here is that a lot of the damage from this weapon is going to be coming from mortal wounds, which adds some utility to the weapon. It makes it much better against targets that either have an odd number of wounds, since the mortal wounds will dump on after the regular damage is applied. So assuming you're going into, let's say, a 5-wound target like a Virtus Praetor, it's going to take you 2 swings to get through each of those targets. If the weapon was 4 damage, the extra 3 damage from 2 converted attacks would spill over and be lost. However, the Reaper of Obliterax is going to be adding that damage on top at the end of your attack sequence, which means it can oftentimes act like 1 or more additional attacks. Even more impressive against lighter infantry, 1-wound models, for example, where the Reaper of Obliterax will essentially deal double damage with each converted wound roll, both inflicting its big 3-damage hit, but then also killing another model thanks to the mortal wound applied at the end. This also has a little bit of a benefit against targets shielded by an invulnerable save, since that invulnerable save is going to be no defense against those mortal wounds. This gives the Reaper of Obliterax an average of about 18.5 damage against an uninvulnerable target, and still almost 12 damage, 11.67 against a target protected by a 4+ invuln. Moving on to the Maw Claws of Thyrax, again, I assumed that this weapon was going to be equipped to a monstrous bone sword flying Hive Tyrant, but one thing to keep in mind is that the Maw Claws of Thyrax may not be attacking with a singular profile, because depending on how late in the game we are, the Maw Claws could have absorbed up to 2 or 3 additional attacks. So I've mapped this out with the base profile, which is 6 attacks with the monstrous bone sword characteristics plus the 2 talons, to almost 17 damage against an uninvulnerable target, closer to 9 damage against a target with an invulnerable save. However, once we max those attacks out, these things start doing massive damage, dealing approximately 25 damage to an unshielded target versus 12.5 damage against someone with an invulnerable save. So my favorite thing about this relic is that it basically creates a mini game for the Hive Tyrant, where if you're able to level up to the point that you can max its attacks out over the course of the game, potentially by killing enemy screening units or forward deployers and then overrunning back to the safety of the Tyrant Guard, then you're going to do dramatically more damage than the equivalent Reaper of Obliterax. But at the base level, it's a little bit worse. That said, it is slightly more efficient than the Reaper, because the Maw Claws automatically reroll all of your wound rolls by themselves, meaning that you do not need to spend a CP for Voracious Appetite to give yourself your full rerolls in order to convert all those hits, which does save you a lot of resources over the course of the game in order to spend to run that guy away. Now let's move on to the monstrous Scything Talon equipped Tyrants. First off, we have the Sides of Tyran. Now, obviously, these guys don't have their reroll ones to hit, but they do have a floating reroll from the Prehensile Pincer Tail. This makes this thing, on average, a little bit better against unshielded targets at about 19 damage versus a target without an invulnerable save, but worse than the Reaper of Obliterax against a target with an invulnerable save. Now moving on to monstrous musculature. This one is a little bit underwhelming, given that the raw damage value of your weapons is going to be slightly lower than the size of Tyran. You do lose out on a point of AP, which can be very relevant, especially against a target that's unprotected by an invulnerable save. Only sitting at AP 3 with those base Scything Talons, even though you're upgraded to 3 damage, does mean that your opponent sometimes gets the chance to save against you, which is a little bit unfortunate. AP 4 punches right through a 3+ save, but AP 3 still allows them a 6-up. That means that against an invuln saveless enemy, the Behemoth Relic is going to have just about the lowest damage output out of any of the relics that we're talking about here, about on par with an unupgraded Maw Claws. But obviously the Maw Claws are going to be upgraded pretty quickly to at least +1 or +2 attacks, which will quickly outstrip the Behemoth Relic. Where it gets a little bit better is against an invulnerable save. Because it also upgrades the characteristic of your foot attacks as well, your damage is spread over a wider variety of attacks, meaning that your opponent making invulnerable saves isn't going to be quite as impactful. This means that they do 10.5 damage against shielded targets, which is slightly worse than the Reaper of Obliterax, but significantly better than the Sides of Tyran. One thing that I will caution about any of the Scything Talon equipped Tyrants is that they are not particularly consistent consistent, since especially if they start to get bracketed, if these guys spike low on their hit rolls, they're not really going to have the consistency of that Lash Whip to pull back. Generally speaking, while the raw numbers from these Tyrants are a little bit higher, you never want your Tyrants to not convert their attacks and potentially get stuck in melee without the ability to overrun. So personally, I tend to lean towards the Monstrous Bone Sword equipped Tyrants, even though their raw damage profiles are a little bit lower. Now, ultimately, I have a soft spot for the Maw Claws of Thyrax because I like the minigame that it brings. I think the Reaper of Obliterax is probably the winner out of all of these. It has slightly less average damage than a maxed Maw Claw Tyrant or a base Sides of Tyran Tyrant. However, being able to inflict mortal wounds at the end of the combat step means that this thing is going to be dealing a lot more reliable damage, even against one wound models, and gives it a lot more utility. Even if you don't want to be spending the CP every turn to Voracious Appetite it, it is going to be rerolling all of its ones to wound from its Lash Whip, and you can use its Prehensile Pincer Tail reroll to reroll one potentially failed wound roll. If you're only attacking with your 5 Reaper attacks and wounding on 2s against an infantry, for example, you probably only need that one reroll, whereas the Maw Claws are going to be a little bit less efficient, assuming that the Tyrant's not bracketed, because they're going to be essentially wasting that Prehensile Pincer Tail ability. I do appreciate how balanced these different relics are, and one thing to keep in mind when you're building your Flying Hive Tyrant is the particular target that you're going to be attacking. If you're attacking large numbers of 3 wound infantry, for example, the Size of Tyran or the Maw Claws are both going to be looking significantly juicier, whereas if you're attacking a lot of 1 wound infantry, the Reaper of Obliterax, with its ability to deal additional mortal wounds, is going to look very good as well. I think the designers have hit it out of the park with these weapons because mathematically, none of them really jump out to me as the obvious choice. All of them are strong in different situations, and it really just depends on what you expect to be fighting. Again, I have a personal preference for the Maw Claws. I think the Reaper of Obliterax is probably going to be the standout, but I think there's definitely an argument for the Size of Tyran and even the Monstrous Musculature Tyrants. So now that we talked about some math about the relic weapons that you should be including on your Hive Tyrants, let's talk about a final verdict. First off, should you include Hive Tyrants in your army? Yes, absolutely. In my opinion, Hive Tyrants are a cornerstone of how the new 9th edition Tyranid Codex is constructed, and I've had a tough time building lists without 2 of them. I found lists that don't have 2 of them alongside a unit of Tyrant Guard to be very lacking, especially on units that can hang out in the middle of the table without being shot to death. Both versions of Hive Tyrants have their merits. Personally, I like wings better because they can actually threaten things like artillery and long-range guns that interact from far away, past the range of your other melee or ranged units, and behind line of sight blockers, and then run away and be basically uninteractable from your opponent. Having the mobility and the ability to pull off the table at the end of your turn available to your army is super duper useful. Battleship Tyrants are a little bit better in a straight up fight, since they do similar damage of Flying Hive Tyrant, but they do so at range. However, a lot of enemies will be protected from ranged attacks, or simply won't commit into the center of the table where that guy can shoot him, and he doesn't really have a recourse against that. If your opponent sees uninteractable, super duper heavy guns that they won't be able to fight against, they're simply not going to be moving out into the open to be shot at, and they're generally going to find other ways to interact with your army. A Flying Hive Tyrant is a much more offensive threat and one that can react to those style of defensive game plans, whereas the Battleship Hive Tyrant basically has to sit around and wait for your opponent to come to them. One thing I do appreciate about the different varieties of Hive Tyrants is that there are a lot of metagame considerations when taking into account which version you should take and what loadout you should bring on them, so I don't really feel like you should actively discard one or the other, but in my opinion, I do think that the Flying Hive Tyrant comes out a little bit ahead of the foot variety. And that's it. That's all I have to say about Hive Tyrants. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about this video and what kind of Hive Tyrant you're going to be bringing in your Tyranid army. Thanks very much for watching all the way to the end of this pretty long video. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channel, especially over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, you people are awesome. Twitch subscribers, also awesome. Everyone in those categories is really just a phenomenal person. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.